In the cool darkness of April 1532, a silent shift of power rippled through the corridors of Florence. Alessandro de Medici, the illegitimate son of Pope Clement VII, assumed the mantle of duke, inaugurating his ascent amid an atmosphere thickened by whispers of illegitimacy and scandal. Born from a clandestine liaison between the Pope and a woman of African descent, Alessandro's heritage was shadowed by controversy from the beginning. The Florentine elite whispered behind closed doors, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken contempt. His skin, noticeably darker than the city's ruling aristocrats, marked him visibly as an outsider, despite his lofty lineage fueling constant murmurs about his legitimacy and suitability for the throne. Alessandro's appointment to the dukedom was orchestrated primarily by the Pope himself, who viewed Florence as crucial to Medici ambitions. Pope Clement VII, sensing his waning influence in the shifting politics of the Italian peninsula, resolved to strengthen Medici dominance by installing his young relative as the duke. Alessandro was seen as a tool of strategic peace on Clement's chessboard, chosen less for merit and more for loyalty and controllability. However, Alessandro's ascension was not without violent conflict. Bitter struggles marred his path to authority, notably the Siege of Florence, where Republicans who resisted the Medici dominance were brutally crushed. Blood ran freely in the city's streets as Republican strongholds fell, cementing Alessandro's rule through force rather than genuine allegiance. Even as the echoes of battle receded, Alessandro's hold on power was anything but secure. From the outset, his dukedom was compromised by the nature of its inception, violence, intimidation, and papal manipulation. Alessandro's court became a place of relentless suspicion. Trust was a luxury none could afford. Advisors and courtiers tiptoed cautiously, mindful of their own vulnerability in a court rife with intrigue. Surveillance became common. Informants whispered secrets into the duke's ear, blurring truth with self-interest. Alessandro himself, while not overtly paranoid, demonstrated an instinctive awareness that his rule rested upon fragile foundations. This sense of fragility bred volatility. At first, Alessandro attempted to legitimize himself through grandiose displays of wealth and authority. Lavish celebrations filled Florence's palatial halls, designed explicitly to awe visitors and assert his position. Alessandro fostered relationships with other influential Italian nobles and prominent European courts, attempting to secure diplomatic legitimacy. However, beneath the grand banquets and carefully choreographed pageantry lay palpable insecurity, a precariousness that soon bred darker behavior. The shadowy rumors swirling around Alessandro were not merely confined to political intrigue. Whispers of moral depravity followed him relentlessly. Tales of scandalous liaisons, excessive drinking, and violent temperament painted a troubling portrait of Florence's new ruler. Some chronicles, penned quietly in secretive diaries, suggested that Alessandro frequently engaged in reckless and humiliating escapades to distract himself from mounting pressures. But perhaps most unsettling were the whispers of strange nighttime rituals, mysterious private ceremonies said to be inspired by obscure Renaissance mysticism. While the details were vague, some contemporaries recorded discomforting rumors of occult practices intended to safeguard Alessandro's precarious position through supernatural means. These strange beliefs, whether authentic or merely elaborate gossip, highlighted the psychological strain of Alessandro's rule. He was caught between the pressures exerted by an expectant Pope Clement VII and a restless Florentine populace. Alessandro's governance quickly became more reactionary than visionary, steeped in immediate concerns for survival rather than long-term strategy. His policies shifted impulsively, driven more by paranoia and fear of betrayal than calculated ambition or ideological principle. Yet Alessandro's early rule was not entirely without advocates. He attempted to curry favor with the masses through limited but strategic gestures of generosity, briefly reducing taxes and engaging in modest public works designed to ease some of Florence's chronic poverty. However, these efforts were sporadic and often overshadowed by more oppressive acts that only deepened popular resentment. Many Florentines quietly perceived his benevolence as superficial, mere crumbs thrown down to placate the masses. Far from fostering stability, Alessandro's policies seemed erratic and insincere, exacerbating tension rather than alleviating it. The Duke's private insecurities soon translated into dangerous unpredictability in governance. Advisors who fell from grace were swiftly and harshly punished. Florence began to see a steady stream of public punishments, gruesome executions, and displays designed explicitly to remind the populace of Alessandro's authority. Bodies of suspected conspirators were left hanging publicly, their bloated forms serving as grim reminders of the consequences awaiting those who dared oppose Medici authority. Thus, Alessandro's early reign set a chilling tone for his dukedom, one that seemed destined to unravel in violence. Each public display of authority hinted at an underlying insecurity. Each act of generosity seemed tinged with the shadow of ulterior motives. Alessandro's early years as duke were thus a fragile balancing act, navigating between brutal suppression and calculated acts of appeasement. It was a strategy driven by fierce suspicion and a desperate yearning for legitimacy qualities that would increasingly dominate Alessandro's brief but tumultuous reign. Unbeknownst to Alessandro himself, these uneasy beginnings planted the seeds for the ultimate tragedy to come. The Duke's volatile mix of paranoia, insecurity, and ruthless ambition would soon catalyze a series of events that led inexorably to his chilling demise by a blade, wielded not by an open enemy but by his own blood. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, had long been renowned as the cradle of Renaissance culture and philosophy. Under Alessandro de Medici's troubled reign, however, it swiftly became a nexus of corruption and moral decay. The young duke's governance, founded upon ruthless authority, soon manifested in a series of policies and personal behaviors that dragged Florence into a dark spiral, gradually alienating the very society he sought to dominate. As Alessandro solidified his rule, his attention turned increasingly inward. His court became synonymous with decadence, extravagant revelry, and notorious excesses. While such indulgences were common among the European nobility, Alessandro's indulgence was marked by a particularly wanton disregard for moral restraint. Lavish festivities in the Medici palaces were legendary for their extravagance, attended by a select circle of courtier sycophants and dubious characters drawn from across Italy. Wine flowed freely, served in goblets of Venetian crystal. Banquets overflowed with delicacies imported from far-flung territories, symbolizing Alessandro's expansive but precarious grasp on power. Yet beneath the sparkling facade, a darker narrative brewed. Florence's treasury, already strained by political instability and military expenditure, suffered greatly from Alessandro's extravagant tastes. To sustain this reckless expenditure, Alessandro turned to oppressive taxation, disproportionately targeting the city's burgeoning merchant class. Merchants who once flourished under the protection of previous Medici rulers now faced crippling financial pressures. The artisans and shopkeepers integral to Florence's economic vitality bore the brunt of Alessandro's lavishness and desperation. Resentment grew steadily among these once prosperous citizens, their loyalty increasingly replaced by silent defiance and secretive plotting. But Alessandro's corruption was not limited to financial exploitation. Justice under his rule was frequently arbitrary, often grotesque in its public manifestations. Accusations of treason or sedition were commonplace. The trials that followed were swift, cruel, and frequently lacking substantial evidence. The Florentine judiciary, once admired for its fairness and moderation, became a tool wielded by Alessandro's hand, manipulated to crush dissent and intimidate potential rivals. Prominent Florentines were arrested on charges that were at times patently absurd, their public humiliation and torture serving as calculated demonstrations of Alessandro's absolute authority. One infamous example that highlighted Alessandro's brutality was the chilling execution of a respected Florentine merchant named Giovanni Bartolomei. Accused on flimsy evidence of plotting against the Duke, Giovanni was subjected to horrifying public torture. Records from the period describe in haunting detail the merchant's slow execution by a method known as the strappado, where he was repeatedly hoisted by ropes. His arms twisted painfully behind his back until his limbs dislocated, a grotesque spectacle designed to instill fear into observers. Such horrifying displays not only terrorized the populace, but also deeply unsettled Florence's cultural and intellectual community, signaling that no one, regardless of their prominence, was immune from Alessandro's wrath. This brutal justice was mirrored in Alessandro's personal conduct, marked by increasingly troubling excesses. Tales of his mistreatment of women circulated widely through whispered conversations and secretive correspondence. Alessandro's infamous predatory behavior became an open scandal, documented by contemporary observers who noted his reckless disregard for social norms and moral boundaries. Allegations frequently arose of Alessandro coercing young women into attending his private gatherings, after which they would mysteriously vanish from public view. Though many of these stories remained cloaked in secrecy, their persistence and consistency painted a disturbing portrait of the Duke's unchecked cruelty and privilege. The consequences of Alessandro's unchecked immorality and cruelty gradually infected the very fabric of Florentine society. Corruption became rampant within the city's administrative apparatus, where positions of authority were sold to the highest bidder, rather than awarded by merit. Bribery became endemic, eroding trust in civic institutions and further isolating Alessandro from the population he ostensibly governed. Many Florentines grew cynical, seeing the Duke's rule as little more than legalized exploitation, hollowing out the city's once proud sense of civic virtue. To add insult to injury, Alessandro exacerbated public resentment by placing his closest allies, often foreign mercenaries and loyalists of questionable moral character, in critical administrative and military positions. The most infamous of these was the brutal and feared captain of his personal guard, Girolamo degli Albizzi, who became notorious for his cruelty and sadistic tendencies. Albizzi's methods of extracting confessions from suspected dissenters often involved barbaric torture carried out openly to discourage any resistance. The Duke himself sanctioned these methods, implicitly endorsing brutality as a hallmark of his regime. However, it was not only Alessandro's enemies who suffered. Even his supporters, once loyal, found themselves vulnerable to sudden shifts in the Duke's unpredictable temper. Members of his court lived in perpetual anxiety, fearful of displeasing him. Alessandro's mercurial temperament, prone to sudden and violent shifts, instilled a sense of constant dread. Trusted courtiers could abruptly fall from grace, exiled or imprisoned on mere suspicion of disloyalty, their fall as sudden and merciless as their initial rise had been rapid. Within this bleak environment, Florence became fertile ground for conspiracy. Aristocrats and commoners alike shared clandestine conversations in hushed tavern corners and shadowy alleyways. Discussions focused on one theme above all others: the Duke's removal. Some sought foreign alliances to oust Alessandro, while others whispered fervently of assassination and rebellion. The notion of violence, once shocking and taboo, gradually transformed into a matter of serious contemplation among Florentines desperate to end the tyranny they endured. Thus, Alessandro's reign transformed Florence from a beacon of Renaissance progress into a cauldron of simmering unrest. His excesses had ignited a silent fury that permeated all levels of society, creating conditions ripe for betrayal and upheaval. The Duke himself, though seemingly unassailable, stood oblivious to the extent of the hatred he had fostered, blind to the dangerous tides gathering quietly around him. Little did he realize how deeply he had sown the seeds of his own destruction, seeds that would soon bear fruit in the form of familial betrayal and bloody violence. As Alessandro de Medici's reign deepened into cruelty, the Florentine populace found itself staring at the unsettling portrait of a ruler increasingly defined by violence and paranoia. The Duke's brutality evolved from mere impulse to calculated policy, crafting his image into that of a feared tyrant. Alessandro became notorious not only for political oppression, but also for the disturbing psychological intensity he brought to his rule. A dark portrait compounded by grotesque punishments, macabre rituals, and a creeping madness that haunted his every move. Alessandro's taste for violent spectacle was methodical, calculated to instill lasting terror. Execution methods under his rule grew notably savage. Prisoners, often accused on flimsy or fabricated charges, met fates of gruesome creativity. Records tell of one particularly notorious punishment in which Alessandro ordered the public dismemberment of a nobleman accused of conspiring against him. Bound to stakes in the Piazza della Signoria, the unfortunate victim was systematically dismembered while still alive, his screams reportedly echoing through the city's streets, chilling all who bore witness. Such horrifying exhibitions were no accident. They were meticulously orchestrated demonstrations of Alessandro's total authority, intended to etch into Florentine memory the ruthless consequences awaiting traitors. These spectacles, however, reflected not only political calculation, but a deeper psychological complexity within Alessandro himself. The Duke's increasing fascination with cruelty hinted at a fractured psyche. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that Alessandro began participating personally in certain punishments, attending them with an unsettling, almost clinical curiosity. One documented incident describes Alessandro personally overseeing the brutal torture of a courtier suspected of betrayal, asking detailed questions about the physical sensations experienced by the condemned man. Such macabre inquisitions unnerved even his closest attendants, leaving a lasting impression of a ruler increasingly detached from normal human empathy. Alessandro's psychological instability became more overtly apparent as his reign progressed. The Duke developed peculiar habits and rituals designed to protect him from perceived threats, both real and supernatural. Chroniclers of the period noted Alessandro's fixation with talismans and protective amulets. He surrounded himself with astrologers, magicians, and soothsayers, seeking reassurance through mystical means as paranoia took hold. Each morning, Alessandro's chambers echoed with the chanting of ritualistic incantations, rituals designed to ward off harm, real or imagined. Though hidden from public view, whispers about these disturbing habits seeped into the streets, adding to the aura of eerie mystery that shrouded his reign. Alessandro's increasing preoccupation with the occult, combined with his unpredictability, alienated even the members of his immediate circle. Nobles and courtiers previously loyal, or at least tolerant of his excesses, began distancing themselves, quietly fearful of becoming ensnared in the Duke's madness. His psychological deterioration had visible consequences for Florence itself. Civic and diplomatic functions diminished noticeably, replaced by increasingly frequent outbursts of paranoia and suspicion. Alessandro's erratic decrees multiplied orders driven by whim rather than any coherent political strategy. Policies were enacted abruptly, then abandoned just as quickly, leaving administration in chaos and amplifying public discontent. The corrosive nature of Alessandro's psychological decline was further highlighted by the growing isolation within his personal life. Those few he trusted were kept dangerously close, subject to his intense scrutiny, and many were discarded swiftly if their loyalty came into doubt. Reports from the Medici palace describe Alessandro's nocturnal pacing through empty corridors, muttering anxiously to himself, clearly tormented by imagined threats. Servants whispered anxiously about the Duke's inability to sleep, as well as his troubling habit of conversing with unseen companions in his private chambers. Such accounts added a spectral dimension to his reign, amplifying his terrifying reputation throughout Florence. Yet amid the escalating violence and paranoia, Alessandro sought occasional refuge in artistic patronage, a tradition inherited from earlier Medici rulers. His attempts to present himself as a cultured patron of the Renaissance arts, however, struck many observers as hollow and superficial. Alessandro commissioned portraits of himself by prominent artists, including the renowned painter Jacopo Pontormo, who depicted the Duke with an enigmatic and disquieting intensity. These portraits captured more than just physical likeness. They reflected the unsettling psychological dimensions of Alessandro's character, hinting subtly at the inner turmoil beneath his imposing exterior. Indeed, Pontormo's famous portrait of Alessandro, a masterpiece now hanging in the Uffizi Gallery, captured this complexity vividly. Alessandro appears authoritative, yet strangely vulnerable, his gaze penetrating, yet haunted. The painting stirred controversy upon its unveiling. Contemporaries whispered that the artist had inadvertently revealed too much of the Duke's troubled soul. Today, scholars continue to debate whether Pontormo intentionally hinted at Alessandro's psychological fragility, subtly encoding the deep-seated paranoia and cruelty that defined his later years. Alessandro's court soon became characterized by its dangerous volatility, his unpredictable moods shaping daily life within the Palazzo Vecchio. Courtiers, servants, and advisors treaded carefully, constantly vigilant, lest they inadvertently provoke the Duke's ire. Such vigilance became exhausting, fueling the pervasive tension that defined Alessandro's court. His paranoia became increasingly self-fulfilling, isolating him further and reinforcing his suspicions of betrayal. But the deeper tragedy lay in Alessandro's utter blindness to the fact that he himself was the source of this instability. His oppressive rule, violent tendencies, and erratic behavior sowed the very discontent he feared. The city that had once welcomed him, if grudgingly as a symbol of Medici dominance, now viewed him with fear and hatred. His attempts to project strength through violent spectacle had ironically weakened his position, eroding his support and fragmenting the loyalty he desperately needed. Florence had become a city defined by the twisted psychology of its ruler, a psychology manifested through disturbing punishments, sinister rituals, and troubling behaviors that haunted observers and subjects alike. Alessandro's reign had spiraled into madness and terror, setting a stage primed for conspiracy and violence. In the shadows, hidden but not forgotten, lurked those prepared to exploit his vulnerabilities, none more dangerous nor ultimately more lethal than his own cousin Lorenzino de Medici, whose quiet presence at court would soon become the catalyst for Alessandro's final chilling undoing. In the shadowy corridors of Alessandro de Medici's palace, where whispers echoed like soft, malevolent winds, one figure moved with careful deliberation: Lorenzino de Medici, cousin to the Duke. A young man of keen intellect and sharp ambition, Lorenzino initially appeared unassuming, often dismissed by courtiers as little more than a charming but harmless figure in the Duke's retinue. Yet beneath this carefully cultivated facade, Lorenzino harbored ambitions darkened by jealousy and resentment. Quietly but relentlessly, he wove a web of treachery that would ultimately ensnare Alessandro himself. Lorenzino's background had set the stage perfectly for his betrayal. Born into a lesser branch of the Medici family, he had long existed in Alessandro's shadow, perpetually sidelined in favor of his more powerful cousin. In his youth, Lorenzino cultivated a scholarly demeanor, immersing himself in literature, philosophy, and poetry. His intellectual pursuits made him seem benign, even cultured, disguising an underlying bitterness born of obscurity. Within Florence's elite circles, Lorenzino became known as Lorenzaccio, Little Lorenzo, a nickname tinged with affectionate mockery, implying his insignificance and lack of ambition. Ironically, this very reputation served Lorenzino well. Beneath the guise of scholarly detachment, Lorenzino quietly observed Alessandro's tyrannical excesses, taking careful note of every cruelty, every humiliation inflicted upon Florentine society. The more Alessandro spiraled into paranoia and violence, the more deeply Lorenzino resented his cousin's authority, and the disdainful ease with which Alessandro wielded power. Over time, Lorenzino's bitterness curdled into calculated hatred, fueling a single-minded determination to end the Duke's brutal reign. Yet Lorenzino understood that betrayal required patience and subtlety. Rather than openly opposing Alessandro, which would have been suicide, he opted instead for the role of the trusted confidant. Using his natural charm and cultivated wit, Lorenzino gradually earned Alessandro's confidence, cleverly positioning himself as an indispensable companion. He engaged in Alessandro's excesses, accompanying the Duke on nocturnal escapades and lavish banquets, skillfully mirroring his cousin's vices and ambitions to solidify his position at court. Behind this mask of complicity, Lorenzino concealed a methodical and patient predator's cunning. He built alliances, quietly speaking in hushed tones to those disgruntled nobles who sought Alessandro's downfall. Conversations unfolded in darkened corridors and secluded chambers, often beneath the veneer of literary and philosophical discussions. Lorenzino's intellectual reputation became the perfect shield, allowing him to communicate his intentions through metaphor and subtle insinuation, minimizing suspicion even among vigilant informants loyal to the Duke. A particularly disturbing detail about Lorenzino's method emerged in his meticulous preparation for murder. Historical records indicate that as his plan took shape, Lorenzino immersed himself obsessively in histories and dramas of political assassination. He was especially fascinated by ancient texts recounting betrayals and murders, notably Plutarch's Lives, and the Roman histories, drawing inspiration from Brutus's infamous betrayal of Julius Caesar. Lorenzino's private chambers became filled with these accounts, his annotations scrawled feverishly in the margins, reflecting an almost morbid fixation with the mechanics of betrayal. It was as if he rehearsed Alessandro's assassination repeatedly in his mind, perfecting every detail of deception and execution. Meanwhile, Alessandro, blinded by vanity and increasingly disconnected from reality, saw no threat in Lorenzino's companionship. Instead, the Duke found solace and entertainment in his cousin's presence. Lorenzino provided witty banter, intellectual stimulus, and a willing accomplice for Alessandro's excesses. The Duke's trust deepened, and Alessandro came to view Lorenzino almost as a younger brother, oblivious to the danger lurking beneath the surface. In fact, Alessandro's blindness to Lorenzino's true intentions spoke volumes about his deteriorating judgment and paranoia. His frequent outbursts of suspicion toward courtiers and advisors contrasted starkly with his inexplicable trust in Lorenzino. Courtiers noted privately the irony of Alessandro's distrustful temperament being so easily manipulated by his seemingly harmless cousin. Some privately speculated that Alessandro's paranoia had grown so intense that only Lorenzino, who mirrored his excesses and indulged his darker whims without judgment, seemed safe and trustworthy. This perverse logic placed Alessandro firmly in Lorenzino's deadly grasp. As Lorenzino continued to play the role of loyal confidant, his schemes progressed methodically toward their climax. Through calculated manipulation, he secured Alessandro's trust to the extent that the Duke became increasingly isolated from other advisors, relying more heavily upon Lorenzino for counsel and companionship. In doing so, Lorenzino systematically weakened Alessandro's connections with other powerful figures at court, leaving him increasingly vulnerable. Lorenzino's web tightened imperceptibly around the Duke, pulling Alessandro into an isolation so complete that by the time danger was clear, escape would be impossible. Throughout these clandestine preparations, Lorenzino continued to exhibit chilling patience. Records from contemporary sources note that Lorenzino maintained his composure impeccably in public, even attending executions and punishments alongside Alessandro with apparent detachment. Observers found it unsettling how calmly Lorenzino watched scenes of torture and death ordered by Alessandro, neither protesting nor flinching, betraying no hint of inner turmoil or moral conflict. It was as though in Lorenzino's eyes these events merely reinforced the necessity and righteousness of his mission. By early 1537, Lorenzino's treachery was nearing its apex. He now had everything in place: the trust of the Duke, the quiet complicity of certain disaffected nobles, and an intricately crafted facade that concealed his intentions flawlessly. Florence's atmosphere, thick with tension and suspicion, seemed oblivious to the subtle shift in power unfolding beneath its very eyes. As Alessandro drifted ever deeper into paranoia and cruelty, Lorenzino moved calmly forward, preparing the final stages of a betrayal that would alter history. Yet the sheer audacity of Lorenzino's plan raises a compelling question. How could Alessandro, so consumed by paranoia, fail to perceive the betrayal brewing at his side? The answer lies in the psychological brilliance of Lorenzino's deception. By presenting himself as harmless, almost trivial, and thus effortlessly overlooked, Lorenzino weaponized Alessandro's arrogance against him. Alessandro, obsessed with grandeur and dominance, could never have imagined that the greatest threat to his rule might lie hidden in plain sight, disguised as the innocuous and intellectually curious cousin he trusted implicitly. Thus Lorenzino's trap was set. Florence, poised unknowingly on the precipice of bloody upheaval, would soon witness the culmination of this sinister betrayal. A betrayal born not from open rebellion, but quiet resentment, patient manipulation, and a chilling scholarly obsession with assassination. Within the hidden corners of Alessandro's lavish court, Lorenzino de Medici's meticulous charade of loyalty reached its sinister crescendo. Having carefully maneuvered himself into the very heart of the Duke's inner circle, Lorenzino's mask of faithful companion became inseparable from his true identity in Alessandro's eyes. The Duke, ever suspicious of betrayal yet tragically blind to its imminent presence, allowed Lorenzino into his closest confidences, unaware that each shared secret only sharpened the blade being quietly prepared for him. Lorenzino's facade was not merely passive deception, but an active performance crafted with precision and nuance. He learned and mirrored Alessandro's tastes, adopting the Duke's luxurious habits, matching his decadent excesses stride for stride. Lorenzino's behavior became indistinguishable from genuine affection, earning him unprecedented access and favor. Alessandro frequently confided his insecurities and fears to his cousin, viewing him as perhaps the only true confidant in his increasingly isolated world. Ironically, it was Alessandro's desperate need for trust that Lorenzino exploited, masterfully converting the Duke's paranoia into a weapon against himself. One particularly unsettling detail highlights the depths of Lorenzino's manipulation: the calculated way he fostered Alessandro's dependence on him, by subtly fueling his paranoia. On multiple occasions, historical records suggest Lorenzino secretly orchestrated false threats against the Duke, fake conspiracies carefully fabricated to inflame Alessandro's suspicion and paranoia. Lorenzino would then heroically uncover these imaginary plots himself, appearing as the vigilant protector of Alessandro's life. Such tactics ensured Alessandro increasingly saw Lorenzino as indispensable a critical ally, safeguarding his reign from unseen enemies, utterly unaware that the true danger lay in the man whispering warnings into his ear. Alessandro's deepening trust also allowed Lorenzino unprecedented influence over the Duke's political decisions. With careful subtlety, Lorenzino began isolating Alessandro from other powerful figures at court, discreetly discrediting rivals through whispered suggestions of treachery. This methodical erosion of Alessandro's relationships was strategic, designed to leave the Duke politically weakened, socially isolated, and emotionally dependent upon Lorenzino alone. Florentine courtiers, initially skeptical, gradually came to perceive Lorenzino's closeness to the Duke as impenetrable, leaving Alessandro vulnerable and friendless at the pinnacle of power. But Lorenzino's manipulation went further still. To ensure Alessandro would suspect nothing, Lorenzino reinforced his image through conspicuous gestures of loyalty. Publicly, he appeared fiercely protective of the Duke's safety, sometimes violently confronting courtiers whose loyalty he questioned performances designed solely for Alessandro's benefit. On one infamous occasion, Lorenzino physically assaulted a courtier in public, accusing the man loudly of plotting against Alessandro. The episode, shocking in its suddenness, further convinced Alessandro of Lorenzino's genuine devotion. The accused courtier, innocent of the charges, vanished mysteriously. Soon afterward, his fate a grim demonstration of Lorenzino's ruthless efficiency in maintaining his disguise. Meanwhile, Lorenzino's preparations for the assassination moved steadily toward completion. Historical accounts detail meticulous planning, down to the smallest particulars, revealing Lorenzino's chilling precision. Knowing Alessandro's weaknesses intimately, Lorenzino selected the moment, the location, and even the method of murder with unnerving care. The Palazzo Medici, Alessandro's private residence, was chosen specifically because the Duke considered it secure, guarded, and impenetrable to enemies. It was precisely this false security that Lorenzino intended to exploit, aware that Alessandro would never anticipate betrayal from within these walls. To further guarantee the assassination's success, Lorenzino recruited a trusted accomplice, Scoronconcolo, a notorious bravo and mercenary known for his skill and ruthlessness. Historians note Scoronconcolo's violent reputation, describing him as a cold-blooded killer, well acquainted with death. Lorenzino introduced Scoronconcolo into Alessandro's circle under the pretense of enhancing the Duke's personal guard. Alessandro, convinced by Lorenzino's assurances, readily accepted this dangerous man into his household, blissfully unaware that he had just welcomed one of his future executioners. Amid these preparations, Lorenzino's own behavior grew increasingly intense and psychologically unsettling. Contemporary accounts describe episodes of deep introspection, during which Lorenzino spoke cryptically about destiny and sacrifice. Moments when his facade momentarily slipped, revealing glimpses of a man driven by powerful inner turmoil. At night, courtiers sometimes heard Lorenzino pacing his chambers restlessly, muttering lines from classical texts on betrayal, almost rehearsing the scenario repeatedly as though he were living out a tragic theatrical drama rather than planning a brutal assassination. These unsettling habits hinted at Lorenzino's troubled psyche, burdened by the enormity of what he was about to commit. By late 1536, the trap was nearly set. Lorenzino carefully choreographed every interaction with Alessandro, meticulously cultivating circumstances that would place the Duke alone and vulnerable at precisely the right moment. He arranged private gatherings and clandestine rendezvous, subtly conditioning Alessandro to accept secrecy as routine. Each successful maneuver deepened Alessandro's sense of security around Lorenzino, blinding him to the fatal purpose lurking beneath their camaraderie. Yet perhaps the most psychologically disturbing element of Lorenzino's deception was his genuine affection toward Alessandro, complicated by envy, resentment, and ambition. Though he despised the Duke's tyranny, Lorenzino could not fully escape a twisted familial bond that had grown over years of intimacy. This complex emotional entanglement did not dissuade him, but rather added an unsettling layer of psychological intensity to his betrayal. Scholars speculate that this emotional ambivalence explained Lorenzino's obsession with historical betrayals. He recognized echoes of himself in figures like Brutus, simultaneously loyal and vengeful, devoted yet murderous. Thus, Lorenzino's masquerade of trust was perfected through a chilling combination of emotional manipulation, strategic cunning, and deeply disturbing psychological gamesmanship. Alessandro, increasingly isolated and emotionally dependent, perceived Lorenzino as his protector, his closest confidant in a court filled with treachery. Ironically, this very closeness became the Duke's greatest vulnerability. With meticulous patience, Lorenzino had crafted a scenario in which Alessandro himself unknowingly cooperated with his own impending murder. The Duke, now entirely ensnared by the cousin he trusted implicitly, stood poised on the brink of a betrayal that would echo chillingly through Florentine history, a betrayal executed not by distant enemies, but by a familiar hand wielded by the very man Alessandro had embraced as family. The cold night of January 6, 1537, settled quietly over Florence. Amid the city's shadowed streets, Alessandro de Medici moved discreetly, driven by an invitation he could not refuse, a clandestine meeting arranged by the one man he believed beyond suspicion, his cousin Lorenzino. For the Duke, such secretive rendezvous were not uncommon, blending seamlessly into his habitually reckless lifestyle. Tonight, however, Alessandro walked unwittingly toward a grim destiny, meticulously prepared by Lorenzino, a destiny that would unfold with chilling precision. Lorenzino had chosen his moment with strategic cunning. Alessandro was scheduled to leave Florence shortly for Rome, summoned by Pope Paul III for critical diplomatic discussions. Time was running short, and Lorenzino knew that he might never again find such an ideal opportunity. The Duke, distracted by the urgency of his upcoming departure, lowered his guard, trusting his cousin implicitly, a fatal mistake born of arrogance and isolation. To ensure Alessandro's attendance, Lorenzino had baited his cousin with the irresistible promise of a romantic encounter, exploiting the Duke's notorious predilection for secretive liaisons. He spoke convincingly of a beautiful woman, Caterina Ginori, a married noblewoman whom Alessandro had long admired from afar, but had yet to conquer. The promise of this forbidden meeting enticed Alessandro beyond caution, overriding any lingering suspicion. Thus, as evening descended, Alessandro made his way quietly to Lorenzino's private apartments, confident he was embarking on another pleasurable conquest. Lorenzino's quarters, chosen for their privacy and deceptive comfort, had been carefully prepared for murder. He had dismissed servants early, ensuring no witnesses would interrupt the grim proceedings. Alessandro, unsuspecting, entered the lavishly furnished room, warmly greeted by Lorenzino. The Duke's excitement was evident. He had no inkling of betrayal. Lorenzino, exhibiting perfect calm, suggested that Alessandro relax while awaiting Caterina's arrival. The Duke, accustomed to his cousin's reliability, obliged, discarding his cloak and sword without hesitation, removing any means of defense and unwittingly sealing his fate. Unseen by Alessandro Scoronconcolo, the ruthless mercenary Lorenzino had recruited lay hidden in the adjacent chamber. The assassin's presence went unnoticed, concealed expertly by shadows and silence. Lorenzino, excusing himself briefly under the pretense of fetching Caterina, slipped into the darkened room where Scoronconcolo waited. There they exchanged whispers of confirmation, readying themselves for the moment that would alter Florentine history irrevocably. The quiet tension of the room stretched taut as Alessandro reclined, unaware that death hovered mere moments away. Lorenzino's demeanor as he returned was disturbingly serene, his manner betraying none of the internal turmoil recorded by later historians. Without hesitation, Lorenzino approached Alessandro from behind, producing a concealed dagger in a swift, practiced motion. Historical accounts detail this chilling moment. Vividly, Alessandro, caught entirely off guard, felt the sudden sting of steel biting deeply into his flesh. Lorenzino's initial strike aimed directly at Alessandro's neck, an attempt at immediate fatality. But his aim faltered slightly, and Alessandro recoiled, wounded but not yet incapacitated. A brief, desperate struggle ensued. Alessandro, powerful and enraged, lunged at his cousin, grasping at Lorenzino's clothing, disbelief mingling with furious realization. Yet Lorenzino was not alone. Scoronconcolo emerged swiftly from hiding his blade, flashing ominously in the candlelight. Together, assassin and conspirator overwhelmed Alessandro, driving him violently to the floor. Despite his vigorous resistance, Alessandro's struggle was ultimately futile. Scoronconcolo's blade repeatedly pierced the Duke's body, plunging mercilessly into flesh and muscle, the chamber echoing with desperate gasps and muted cries. Amid the brutal assault, Lorenzino's psychological resolve briefly wavered, an unsettling detail captured vividly by contemporary accounts. Witnesses testifying years later under questioning reported that Lorenzino hesitated momentarily, pale and trembling, seemingly shocked by the savage reality unfolding before him. Yet this hesitation passed quickly, replaced by determined ferocity, as Lorenzino himself delivered additional blows, ensuring Alessandro's demise. Historical documents record Lorenzino muttering cryptically during these final blows, quoting classical texts as though rationalizing the deed through historical precedents. This eerie recital, blending scholarly obsession with visceral violence, added a profoundly unsettling dimension to the act of betrayal. When the violence ceased, Alessandro lay motionless on the blood-soaked floor. The Duke, whose reign had terrorized Florence, now appeared strangely vulnerable in death, a vivid and brutal testament to the violence that defined his life. Lorenzino, breathing heavily, surveyed the scene. Historians note his demeanor shifting abruptly from frantic aggression to unnerving calm, methodically inspecting the corpse for signs of lingering life. Satisfied Alessandro was dead, Lorenzino wiped blood from his dagger with chilling casualness, uttering no words of regret or remorse. However, Lorenzino's careful planning faltered at this critical juncture. In the confusion and adrenaline of the assassination, crucial details had been overlooked. The Duke's body lay exposed, impossible to conceal indefinitely. Lorenzino, realizing the urgency of escape, hurriedly prepared to flee the city. He abandoned the corpse, hastily locking the chamber door and leaving Alessandro sprawled, grotesquely blood-pooling across ornate carpets, a ghastly tableau soon to be discovered. Before departing, Lorenzino gathered essential belongings, betraying a strange mixture of panic and cold calculation. His previous confidence was shaken, replaced by urgent necessity. Within hours, news of the assassination would explode across Florence, igniting chaos and uncertainty. Lorenzino knew his survival hinged upon swift action. Yet even as he fled, his mind lingered perversely upon the grisly scene he left behind. Haunted perhaps by realization that his meticulously planned betrayal had culminated not in triumph, but in bitter violence and uncertain exile. Thus, Alessandro's final moments unfolded a chilling spectacle of calculated betrayal, shocking violence and psychological intensity. The Duke had entered Lorenzino's trap, willingly deceived by trust and desire, utterly blind to the treachery within. His death, both brutal and symbolic, would reverberate through history, a powerful reminder of the volatile interplay between ambition, paranoia, and trust. For Florence, the repercussions were immediate and profound, reshaping political power in unforeseen ways. Yet the haunting question lingered: had Lorenzino truly avenged Florence, or merely substituted one tyranny for another? As dawn broke over Florence on January 7, 1537, its citizens awoke to a city transformed overnight by chaos and fear. The grim discovery of Alessandro de Medici's mutilated corpse ignited a wave of shock and panic, spreading rapidly from palace corridors into the streets. Servants had stumbled upon the scene first, horrified to find the Duke's body sprawled grotesquely, his blood pooling thickly across opulent rugs. Soon afterward, whispers and cries echoed throughout the city, and Florence, already teetering on the brink of upheaval, plunged headlong into turmoil. Immediate confusion gripped the Palazzo Medici. Guards scrambled urgently, attempting to piece together events that had unfolded in Lorenzino's chambers. Yet Lorenzino himself had vanished, leaving behind only empty rooms and unanswered questions. Suspicion immediately turned toward him, yet disbelief mingled with accusation. Lorenzino's reputation as a scholar and confidant seemed incongruous with the bloody murder now ascribed to him, adding another layer of uncertainty to the chaotic aftermath. Florentine authorities, seeking order amid spreading panic, imposed swift measures designed to stabilize the city. Soldiers fanned out through the streets, urgently suppressing rumors and imposing strict curfews. Yet despite these precautions, fear took hold, amplifying every whisper into terrifying certainty. Citizens exchanged furtive glances, uncertain of what or whom to believe. Many Florentines initially refused to accept Alessandro's death, clinging desperately to the hope that the Duke might yet appear injured, but alive to restore stability. But as hours passed, reality became undeniable, forcing Florentines to confront a darker, more disturbing truth. Their ruler was gone assassinated in the heart of his own fortress by someone intimately trusted. Meanwhile, Lorenzino's escape added an air of intrigue and urgency to the unfolding drama. Immediately following Alessandro's murder, Lorenzino fled Florence disguised, employing the careful arrangements he had meticulously prepared for this moment. Traveling lightly, he made for Bologna, intending to seek refuge in Venice. Historians later revealed Lorenzino's hurried journey, documenting the cold precision with which he moved, discarding clothing stained with Alessandro's blood-changing horses at remote locations, and leaving minimal traces of his passage. His escape was so swift and effective that Florentine authorities, despite mounting a vigorous pursuit, failed initially to apprehend him, intensifying the city's growing anxiety. In Florence, chaos deepened as the vacuum left by Alessandro's death became starkly apparent. Nobles and politicians scrambled desperately, each attempting to exploit the crisis to consolidate their own power. The Republican faction, long suppressed under Alessandro's ruthless regime, sensed an opportunity for political renewal. However, the Medici loyalists remained formidable, determined to reassert their dominance by swiftly installing another family member, Cosimo de Medici, as Duke. Political maneuvering swiftly turned violent, sparking street clashes between opposing factions. Florence's public squares became battlegrounds filled with shouts of rage, defiance, and confusion. Yet perhaps more unsettling was the psychological impact Alessandro's murder had upon the city. The sudden and savage nature of the assassination deeply unsettled the populace. Previously viewed as almost invulnerable, a ruthless tyrant whose power seemed impregnable, Alessandro had been cut down brutally within the security of his own palace. The psychological trauma of his violent end spread widely, shattering the illusion of stability, reinforcing the terrifying reality that even Florence's most powerful figures could fall victim to treachery from within. Public executions swiftly became commonplace as authorities sought to restore order through fear. Suspected conspirators, many entirely innocent, were publicly tortured, forced to confess imagined crimes before facing grim executions. One particularly disturbing case involved several household servants of the Medici palace tortured mercilessly to extract false confessions, implicating them in Lorenzino's conspiracy. Contemporary chronicles detail the grotesque public displays of these servants' broken bodies, victims of panicked paranoia, sacrificed to the urgent need to reassert control through fear and intimidation. Lorenzino himself, meanwhile, became the subject of relentless vilification. Once seen as an unassuming intellectual, he was now depicted as a monstrous Judas figure, his very name synonymous with betrayal. Pamphlets circulated throughout Florence and Italy portraying Lorenzino as a sinister, morally bankrupt figure driven by perverse desires and madness. Yet some Florentines quietly admired him, viewing the assassination as necessary to liberate the city from Alessandro's tyranny. This split in public opinion deepened the city's instability, preventing any coherent narrative from emerging and prolonging Florence's internal conflict. Despite his successful escape, Lorenzino's life became an endless series of restless, paranoid movements from city to city. Venice, wary of harboring a known assassin, provided limited refuge. Lorenzino lived a fugitive existence, perpetually anxious, never certain when Medici agents or Florentine authorities might appear. In exile, his demeanor reportedly shifted drastically. Chroniclers noted Lorenzino's increasing paranoia and agitation, describing him as frequently pacing nervously, his eyes darting fearfully at strangers, convinced that each new acquaintance might secretly harbor murderous intent. Lorenzino's betrayal of Alessandro thus became a psychological torment, haunting him relentlessly, transforming his existence into one of perpetual fear and exile. For Florence, Alessandro's assassination became a grim turning point. The city had entered a prolonged period of violence and political instability. The Medici, though shaken, quickly regrouped under Cosimo I, launching a brutal crackdown on Republican dissent and permanently solidifying their grip on power. Alessandro's death, intended by Lorenzino as an act of liberation, inadvertently became the catalyst for even greater tyranny, plunging Florence deeper into oppression. Thus, Alessandro's violent end did not resolve Florence's internal struggles, but amplified them, exposing the city's vulnerabilities to an even harsher regime. Lorenzino's escape and subsequent vilification underscored the complex legacy of the assassination. A city traumatized, a ruling family strengthened through ruthless reprisal, and an assassin condemned to perpetual exile and paranoia. Florence's immediate aftermath revealed a disturbing truth about political violence. It rarely achieves its intended clarity, often creating deeper chaos and suffering. Alessandro's brutal demise, far from freeing Florence, had simply traded one nightmare for another, an unsettling realization that would reverberate hauntingly in Florentine consciousness for decades, and a harsh lesson in the unintended consequences that so often accompany acts of violent betrayal. Alessandro de Medici's brutal assassination reverberated far beyond the blood-stained chambers of the Palazzo Medici. The Duke's violent end reshaped not only Florence, but altered the broader trajectory of Medici power in Italy and Europe. Alessandro's brief and terrifying reign, ended so dramatically by the hand of his own kin, became a cautionary tale about tyranny, betrayal, and the fragile nature of political legitimacy. In the wake of his murder, Florence and the Medici dynasty would struggle profoundly with the traumatic legacy left by Lorenzino's blade. Cosimo de Medici, hastily installed as Alessandro's successor, inherited a city racked by fear and distrust. A distant cousin from a lesser branch of the family, young Cosimo initially appeared inexperienced and malleable, exactly the type of ruler whom Florence's elites hoped would restore stability without perpetuating Alessandro's cruelty. Yet Cosimo quickly demonstrated that he possessed a ruthless pragmatism, even surpassing Alessandro's own. Within months of ascending the dukedom, Cosimo moved aggressively to consolidate power, employing violent purges and oppressive decrees, swiftly extinguishing any lingering republican ambitions. Rather than softening Medici rule, Alessandro's assassination had inadvertently paved the way for an even more formidable and durable tyranny under Cosimo's iron grip. Under Cosimo, Florence transformed dramatically. The Duke's response to Alessandro's murder was not merely to punish conspirators, but to dismantle permanently any structure or institution capable of opposing Medici authority. In effect, Cosimo created an absolutist state, centralizing all political and judicial power directly under his control. Florence's civic institutions, once hallmarks of Renaissance republicanism, were systematically subdued. Freedom of expression vanished, replaced by rigorous censorship and brutal suppression of dissent. Historians suggest Cosimo's extreme measures arose directly from the insecurity produced by Alessandro's violent end, determined to avoid his predecessor's fate. Cosimo pursued ruthless control as the only means of survival. Cosimo's rule was thus directly shaped by the trauma of Alessandro's assassination, a trauma shared by Florence's citizens. The memory of Alessandro's bloody end lingered vividly in public consciousness, reinforced by state-sponsored narratives that portrayed the late Duke as both victim and warning. Cosimo skillfully exploited Alessandro's death, reminding Florentines continuously of the dangers posed by instability, treachery, and rebellion. Public commemorations transformed Alessandro into a martyr-like figure despite his tyrannical excesses, serving as a stark reminder of the fate awaiting those who challenged Medici's supremacy. Ironically, Alessandro's violent demise thus became a powerful ideological tool, reinforcing Medici authority and justifying brutal repression. Lorenzino's legacy, conversely, became deeply problematic and contested. For some Republicans and dissidents across Italy, he represented a heroic symbol of resistance against tyranny, a noble martyr for Republican ideals. Secret pamphlets and writings praising Lorenzino's courage circulated clandestinely despite severe punishments imposed by Cosimo's regime. Yet mainstream Florentine society, subjected to relentless propaganda, largely accepted the vilification of Lorenzino as a traitor and murderer, a dangerous subversive whose betrayal justified Cosimo's heavy-handed governance. Lorenzino himself, still in exile, grappled uneasily with this conflicted legacy, aware his assassination had failed to produce the political liberation he intended. Indeed, Lorenzino's later life reflected the tragic futility and psychological burden of his act. Historical records reveal that Lorenzino drifted restlessly between Venice, Padua, and France, perpetually anxious and paranoid. Medici agents repeatedly hunted him, keeping Lorenzino in constant fear of retribution. Friends and contemporaries noted disturbing changes in his character, observing increased drinking, erratic behavior, and nervous agitation. Lorenzino became fixated on his own safety, often barricading himself indoors for days. Convinced that assassins lurked everywhere, his mental state slowly disintegrating under relentless pressure. Lorenzino's paranoia proved tragically prophetic. In 1548, 11 years after Alessandro's assassination, Medici vengeance finally caught up with him. While residing quietly in Venice, Lorenzino was ambushed in the street by hired assassins, who attacked with swift, ruthless efficiency. Historical accounts describe the brutality of Lorenzino's final moments vividly. He received multiple stab wounds, collapsing in agony onto Venetian cobblestones, dying far from Florence's city walls. His death mirrored Alessandro's own in grim symmetry, bloody, violent, and rooted firmly in treachery. This chilling parallel underscored the inescapable cycle of violence and revenge spawned by Lorenzino's original act. Yet Alessandro's murder had implications far beyond personal vengeance or immediate political upheaval. The event fundamentally reshaped perceptions of Medici legitimacy across Europe, casting a lasting shadow over the dynasty's international image. European courts initially viewed Alessandro's assassination with horror and disbelief, fearing instability might spread across Italy, disrupting delicate balances of power. Cosimo's rise to power, characterized by severe repression, further reinforced the perception of Medici rule as synonymous with tyranny and cruelty. Although Cosimo eventually stabilized, Florence successfully founding a lasting Medici dynasty. European perceptions of the family would remain colored by Alessandro's bloody legacy for generations. Ultimately, the historical significance of Alessandro's assassination lies in its stark demonstration of political fragility and the dangerous interplay between ambition, violence, and paranoia. Alessandro's brutal rule, fueled by insecurity, psychological instability, and oppressive governance, had directly precipitated his downfall, orchestrated by a cousin he trusted implicitly. Lorenzino's act, though driven by sincere political convictions, inadvertently intensified tyranny, reinforcing Medici power and amplifying Florentine suffering. In the end, Alessandro de Medici's assassination became a lasting lesson in the tragic unpredictability of political violence. Lorenzino's dagger ended Alessandro's rule but failed to free Florence from tyranny. Instead, it triggered a violent chain reaction, perpetuating repression and brutality for decades. Alessandro's terrifying final days, culminating in betrayal by his own cousin, remain emblematic of the destructive potential lurking within unchecked ambition, paranoia, and power, an enduring historical warning against the lethal dangers of absolute authority. The assassination of Alessandro de Medici was more than a personal tragedy or political upheaval. It became a powerful historical symbol of the dangerous convergence between paranoia, tyranny, and betrayal. Alessandro's violent demise haunted Florence for generations, serving both as a grim warning against unchecked ambition and as a dark testament to the corrosive power of mistrust. Lorenzino's act, intended to liberate the city from oppressive rule, ironically entrenched Medici tyranny even more deeply, laying the foundations for Cosimo I's brutally effective reign. Emotionally, Alessandro's death traumatized Florentine society, profoundly shattering public perceptions of security and stability. The psychological scars left by the violent end of a ruler betrayed by his closest confidant resonated far beyond Florence's city walls, influencing political thought across Renaissance Europe. Alessandro's legacy, complex and troubling, continues to embody the eternal dangers of isolating power from accountability and empathy. In historical memory, Alessandro and Lorenzino remain entwined figures of tragedy and caution, forever bound together by violence and betrayal. Their intertwined destinies vividly illustrate that political assassinations seldom achieve their intended clarity. Instead, they often deepen chaos, amplify tyranny, and propagate suffering. Thus, Alessandro's death ultimately became not a liberation, but a haunting reminder when power descends into paranoia, and violence trust itself becomes weaponized, destroying both rulers and those who challenge them.